Here's a little something since you can't afford gifts this year. My mother said on Christmas morning, handing me a check written for $100 with the kind of sympathy in her voice that made it clear this gesture was less about generosity and more about pity. We were sitting in the living room of my parents' modest suburban home in Ohio, surrounded by carefully wrapped presents from my younger brother and sister. Gifts that my parents had purchased and wrapped, gifts that had cost substantially more than $100. Gifts that were positioned as evidence of my siblings' capability to provide while my mother's pity check suggested I was somehow not capable of basic adult functioning. The check was handed to me with commentary. "We know things have been tight for you. Your father and I just wanted to help you out. Don't feel bad about not having anything for us this year. We understand." The way she said it made it clear that tight was her generous interpretation of my financial situation, that she actually believed I was struggling, that she was performing sympathy for a child she viewed as fundamentally unsuccessful. I'd accepted the check with a smile and a thank you, the same way I'd been accepting pity for years, the same way I'd been letting my family believe that I was doing poorly financially when in fact I was operating at a level of wealth that they couldn't actually conceptualize. What they didn't know was that I'd spent the last 15 years building an investment portfolio worth approximately $340 million, that I'd made strategic financial decisions that had positioned me as someone who could literally purchase almost anything I wanted, that my parents' dream house, the 1920s colonial they'd been talking about moving into for the past 20 years, was the kind of property that I could acquire with less than 1% of my liquid assets. So I decided to use that $100 check as the foundation for something that would fundamentally alter how my family understood my actual financial situation. My name is Alexandra Pierce, and I'm 43 years old, which means I've lived long enough to understand that the people closest to you often have the least accurate understanding of who you actually are and what you've actually accomplished. I come from a middle-class background. My father, Mark, worked in manufacturing management, and my mother, Susan, worked in school administration. They were responsible, hard-working people who provided for their 3 children in a stable, comfortable way. But they were also people who measured success in very specific, narrow terms. Traditional careers, visible income, the kind of achievement that could be announced to other people and understood immediately. When I told my parents after college that I was going to be an investor rather than pursuing a more traditional career path, their response was supportive, but skeptical. My father asked me repeatedly if I'd be okay financially, whether I shouldn't have a real job as a backup. My mother suggested that I might want to consider teaching or nursing, fields where success was more obvious and where the income was stable and predictable. I'd pursued investing anyway, not out of rebellion exactly, but out of genuine fascination with how markets worked, how value was created and destroyed, how wealth actually accumulated over time. I'd read everything I could find about investing strategy. I'd taken online courses. I'd started with the modest sum of money I'd saved working part-time jobs through college, approximately $3,200. Over 30 years, through careful analysis, disciplined decision-making, and a willingness to take calculated risks that most people wouldn't take, I'd transformed that $3,200 into an investment portfolio worth approximately $340 million. I'd owned real estate, commercial properties, startup equity, various securities, and a diversified collection of assets that generated consistent returns regardless of market conditions. But I'd never told my family any of this. I'd never mentioned the portfolio. I'd never discussed the properties I owned. I'd never explained the returns I was generating. I'd simply allowed them to continue believing that I was doing okay, that I was getting by, that I probably wasn't wealthy, but that I was stable enough to maintain my independence. The reasons for this invisibility were complex. Partly, I was protective of my privacy. Partly, I understood that revealing my wealth would create complicated family dynamics, requests for loans, expectations of generosity, assumptions about my time and resources. Partly, I was curious to see how my family would treat me if they didn't know how successful I'd actually become. And partly, I was angry at them, at their repeated suggestions that I was making a mistake, that I needed to pursue something more traditional, that my choice to pursue investing full-time was somehow irresponsible or unambitious. The pity check on Christmas morning wasn't the first pity they'd extended to me. Over the years, there had been subtle suggestions that I was making financial choices that were risky, that I probably wasn't saving enough for retirement, that I should probably get a real job before it was too late. There had been comments comparing my circumstances to my younger sister's, who was a doctor and who had a traditional income and who had therefore clearly made better life choices than I had. My brother, who worked in corporate law, had offered to help me get back on track financially. My parents had sent me money for my birthday several times, not large amounts, but enough to suggest they believed I needed assistance. I'd accepted all of it graciously, the way you do when people you love are trying to help, even if their help is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of your actual circumstances. The $100 pity check on Christmas morning was the moment when I decided that the invisibility needed to end. It wasn't because the check was insulting, though it was in its own way. It was because I realized that the invisibility was allowing my family to continue living in a version of reality that wasn't accurate, and that continuing to allow that to happen was actually not helping anyone. That afternoon, I called the real estate agent who'd been showing me properties in my parents' area. I told her to send me everything. Every listing, every property, every possibility. But I specifically told her to send me information about the house my parents had been talking about for 20 years. A 1920s colonial with original woodwork, a wraparound porch, 5 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, situated on 3 acres with a small pond and extensive gardens. The house was on the market for $1.8 million, a price that reflected its historic significance, its condition, and its location in one of Ohio's most desirable neighborhoods. I reviewed the listing. I made an offer immediately, $1.85 million, all cash, closing within 30 days. The seller accepted within 48 hours. The transaction was processed within 3 weeks, moving with the speed that comes when you have the resources to close quickly and the buyer is representing no financing contingencies. I now own my parents' dream house. The question then became, how to present this reality to my family in a way that would actually force them to recalibrate how they understood me and my financial situation. I scheduled a meeting with my parents for a Sunday afternoon, about a month after Christmas. I told them I wanted to take them somewhere. I didn't tell them where. I just told them to dress nicely and to meet me at a specific location at 2 o'clock. I arranged for a driver to pick them up. I had him take them to the colonial house, the one they'd been talking about for 2 decades, the one they'd never been able to afford. When the car pulled into the driveway, my mother gasped. My father sat silently, staring at the house like he was trying to understand why they'd been brought to their dream house for no apparent reason. I was standing on the porch when they arrived. I was dressed simply, jeans and a sweater, nothing that would necessarily indicate my financial status. But I was holding an envelope containing the deed to the property and the keys to the front door. "Mom, Dad," I said as they approached the porch, "I want to show you something." I opened the front door with the key I had made. I took them through the house, the original hardwood floors, the ornate crown molding, the beautiful fireplace in the formal living room, the spacious kitchen with its vintage details, the bedrooms on the 2nd floor, the office on the 3rd floor that looked out over the gardens. They walked through the house in a kind of stunned silence. My mother was crying. My father kept asking how this was possible, what was happening, why I'd brought them here. When we returned to the front porch, I handed them the envelope containing the deed and the keys. "This is yours," I said simply. "It's the house you've been talking about moving into for the past 20 years. I bought it for you." My mother started crying harder. "Alexandra, this is impossible. This house costs almost $2 million. Where did you get this kind of money?" I told them then. I told them about the investment portfolio I'd been building for 30 years. I told them about the returns I'd been generating. I told them about the properties I owned. I told them about the stocks and the bonds and the real estate investments and the startup equity that had appreciated over time. I told them about the $340 million that represented the accumulation of 3 decades of disciplined investing and careful financial decision-making. My father's reaction was shock followed by what I think was actually pride. He asked detailed questions about my investment strategy. He wanted to understand how I'd built the portfolio. He seemed genuinely impressed. My mother's reaction was more complicated. There was shock, yes. But there was also what looked like guilt. Guilt that she'd been offering me pity checks when I was actually wealthy beyond their comprehension. Guilt that she'd been suggesting I was making financial mistakes when I'd actually been making the smartest financial decisions of anyone in the family. "How long have you known about this?" my father asked. "How long have you been this successful, without telling us?" "About 15 years, I said. I became a millionaire about 15 years ago. It took another 15 years to build it into what it is now. Why didn't you tell us? My mother asked, and I could hear the hurt in her voice. Hurt that I'd kept this from them. Hurt that they'd been treating me like I was struggling when I was actually doing better than they were. Because I wanted to see if you would keep loving me the same way if you didn't think I was successful, I said. Because I wanted to know if your perception of me was based on actual facts or on assumptions you'd made about my choices. Because I needed to know if you would respect me based on who I actually am or based on how much money I'd made. What I didn't tell them was that the answer had been deeply disappointing. What I didn't tell them was that their pity check, their suggestions that I get a real job, their implications that I was making poor financial choices, had all revealed that their respect for me was actually contingent on my success being visible and traditional and easily understood by their social circle. They owned the house. They lived in it happily for the rest of their lives. My mother became the woman who hosted the beautiful parties in the colonial house with the wraparound porch. My father spent his retirement years improving the gardens and restoring original details in the house. But something between us had changed. My parents treated me differently after that day. They treated me with the kind of respect that comes from understanding that your daughter is significantly wealthier and more successful than you are. They asked for my advice on investments. They introduced me to their friends as my daughter Alexandra. She's a very successful investor. They positioned my financial success as a source of family pride. But I also think they felt a kind of loss of the narrative they'd constructed about me, loss of the ability to worry about me or offer me pity, loss of the simplicity of a family relationship where the hierarchy was clear and unquestioned. After I'd given them the house, I told my brother and sister that I had approximately $340 million in investable assets, and that if they were ever in genuine financial crisis, they could come to me for help. I told them that I had no interest in being asked for money casually or in being treated as a family bank. I told them that the help I offered would come with expectations and with transparency about how the money was being used. My sister reacted with shock followed by what looked like resentment. Resentment that I'd been wealthy while she was working 60-hour weeks as a doctor. My brother's reaction was more calculating. He started asking me for investment advice, positioning the relationship as one where he could potentially benefit from my financial expertise. What I realized through all of this was that revealing my wealth didn't actually make my family relationships better. It changed them. It complicated them. It introduced layers of dynamic that hadn't existed when they believed I was merely getting by. Did I regret buying my parents the house? No, I don't regret that at all. I wanted them to have the house. I wanted them to have the security and the joy of living in a property they'd dreamed about for decades. I wanted to give them something that mattered. But I did regret revealing the full extent of my wealth. Not because I shouldn't have revealed it, but because I learned something that I already suspected but hadn't wanted to confirm. That people's respect for you often isn't actually about who you are as a person, but about what you've achieved in ways that they can understand and measure. The $100 pity check became a metaphor for something deeper. It represented my family's inability to see me accurately. It represented their assumptions about my financial situation. It represented their need to position me as less successful than they were, as someone who needed their help, as someone who hadn't made as good choices as they had. When I handed them the keys to the house, I said, "Thanks for the loan," which was technically a reference to the $100 check, but which was also a deeper statement. Thanks for helping me understand that I needed to stop measuring my worth through my family's perception of it, that I needed to stop allowing their limited understanding of success to limit my own self-perception. The house was paid for entirely with my own money. The $100 check wasn't actually a loan. It was just a symbol of the pity and the misunderstanding that had characterized my relationship with my family for years. Now, when I visit my parents in their beautiful colonial house with its wraparound porch and its original woodwork and its spectacular gardens, I see them genuinely happy. They've made the house their own. They've entertained extensively. They've built a version of the life they wanted. But they also treat me differently now. They're careful around me in ways they weren't before. They're aware of the power differential created by the fact that I'm significantly wealthier than they are. They're conscious of the possibility that their daughter could essentially purchase their home or their security or their future at any time. That awareness has created a distance between us that I don't think will ever be entirely bridged. They love me, I think. But they also respect me now in a way that's tinged with something else. Perhaps a recognition that they never fully understood who their daughter actually was, that they missed the opportunity to know me as a successful investor and instead only began to respect me once I'd demonstrated my wealth in undeniable terms. The house was worth $1.8 million. It represents my love for my parents and my gratitude for the foundation they provided for me. But it also represents something more complicated. The understanding that sometimes the most significant gifts we give to the people we love come with costs we don't anticipate, and that visibility always has consequences, even when you're finally allowing yourself to be seen for who you actually are.